Hello again. Here we are. We're going to talk about functionalism a little bit. This is an interesting. I like the title of this little presentation. American Psychology Takes Hold. You got to remember that up till now, our discussion of psychology it basically ended with Titchener. We took a little side trip in intelligence testing there and stuff. But we left off with Titchener, and Titchener, though he was in America, you got to remember that two things. Number one, he was clearly the product of his British upbringing and the German education that he got with Wilhelm Wundt. So even though Titchener dominated psychology there, it was really not American psychology, even though he was in America, right? So here's where we're going to start to talk about where American psychology becomes American psychology. And by that, what I really mean is that, in fact, in Europe, they followed a different intellectual tradition, a different philosophical tradition. That is to say, here in America, we trace our psychology back to the philosophies of empiricism and rationalism. But the romanticists and the existentialists, which were sort of like side notes and become of interest later on when we start talking about counseling or something, the romanticists and the existentialists have almost nothing to say about the experimental side of psychology in this rise. So it is in this chapter here, this unit, that we're going to talk about how American psychology actually begins, okay? So here's a cute little quote. In his 1929 APA presidential address, James McKeen Cattell describes the history of psychology before the 1880s as this. The history would be as short as a book on snakes in Ireland since the time of St. Patrick. In other words, there are none. So, interesting. Insofar as psychologists are concerned, America was then like heaven, for there was not a damned soul. All right? That's pretty cute. His assumption, though, was that psychology equals experimental psychology. There had been some psychology in America, one that doesn't get a lot of play in these textbooks, but the psychology in the early part of the United States was really moral philosophy more than anything, mental philosophy. Concerned matters of the soul. It was pretty much so deeply ingrained with religious thoughts that as to be almost inseparable. It included things such as ethics, divinity, and philosophy, which aren't exactly completely non-psychological, but it's definitely not really where we were. So we find that the first president of Columbia University actually took John Locke's ideas and wrote a book about things such as child psychology, the nature of knowledge. So this stuff has clearly been around in the United States, just not really dominating the area. In what they call stage 2, intellectual philosophy, it really came out of, if you remember Thomas Reid and his common sense philosophy, and it was just, you just trust your feelings and stuff. I don't know. It's not really, again, I don't know that much about it, but apparently there was a textbook written in 1868, right? The human intellect, with an introduction upon psychology and the soul. So the word soul is right there in that psychology textbook. Clearly that doesn't bode well for science. During the U.S. Renaissance, we find that religion was removed, psychology was in, and they started to become more experimental in nature. Say the American Journal of Psychology was first published. William James wrote his book Principles of Psychology, which became the original psychology textbook, which was removed from religion and philosophy, truly a psychology textbook. Quite an interesting book, by the way. William James's Principles of Psychology. When he published it originally, it was no, that's not right. His original book's just called Psychology. And his psychology book, he published it, and it was 1,000 pages. It took him a long time to write it. And he sends it in to the publisher with an apology letter saying, I'm sorry I wrote such a bloated monster. Nothing is worth 1,000 pages. And so then what happens is that he writes a shorter version called Principles of Psychology, which is about 500 pages. And they affectionately refer to the full psychology 1,000-page book as James, and then the shorter version they simply refer to as Jimmy. All right, Jimmy and James. Lovely. However, the idea is that psychology was connected to evolutionary thinking, big time. People adapt to their environments, and that's what behavior is all about: is adaptation, adapting to your environment, changing to fit in. Then along comes stage 4. Quite an interesting thing. They're saying it's 1896 to present. Look at that, to present. This is important because the very last slide is going to say what is the fate of functionalism, I believe is what the last slide says. And clearly, to present tells us it's still alive. It's still around, okay? So, quick recall, as I said, the last time we talked about Titchener, we had said Titchener was incredibly influential in the history of psychology because everybody looked at what Titchener did and said, you suck. You suck so bad, we can do better. One of the things that Titchener had been doing was, remember, looking for the elements of consciousness, trying to break it down. Well, the functionalists said, okay, that's just stupid. I don't care what the elements are. I want to know what's the purpose. Why do we have it? What is the function? Okay. Clearly, this is coming from Darwinian thinking. What is the function? Remember, just a slide ago, I said adaptation. Behavior is about adapting. What is the function? The function is to adapt, right? And so the interest was in the function of the mind, not its contents, not its breakdown. Okay. And so, where am I? Yeah. So the functionalist psychology was opposed, didn't like the idea of searching for the elements of consciousness because it was just useless. What's the point? What's the point of telling me the elements, all right? And, knowing the periodic table equals oxygen, hydrogen, helium, you're not a genius. That's stupid. That's nothing. That's not knowledge, okay? Knowledge is understanding how they work together, what purposes they have, okay? So the function of the mind, what it is for, not a static description, what it is. They felt that psychology was a practical science, not a pure science. At this point in history, the application of anything was considered to be very, very crude. In the same sense now, I mean, even in this day and age, an engineer that designs vehicles gains respect. A mechanic that fixes automobiles does not gain respect. In other words, the pure study of engineering gets respect. The applied engineering, which is what a mechanic really is, applied engineering does not get respect. Okay, and this exact same kind of a distinction was true in the field of psychology, that all of these, in particular Titchener, oh my goodness, I mean, Titchener was just like, he absolutely hated the idea of applying psychology. It was just the worst thing he could imagine. He felt it dirtied himself. We'll come back to Freud on this one later. Freud felt the same thing. Being a you shouldn't actually talk to a patient. No, you should do research in a laboratory, okay? Well, partly this comes out of some ideological thing that it should be a practical discipline. Remember, going back to Francis Bacon, who said the goal of science is to make the world a better place, period, right? So that idea has been around for a long time, but it also came out of the practical nature of it, that universities were starting to say, you know what, I think we're done funding the bill on these departments that aren't actually producing anything, all right? All you're doing is talking, all right? Give me something I can use, then we'll talk about funding your discipline. So it was the result of these kinds of things too. But they also felt that you could study animals, children, abnormals. I mean, everybody had something to add to this. Mental processes and behavior. Okay, but anyway, it comes down to it was all influenced by Darwin. The original functionalist, although there is no founder in the sense that Wilhelm Wundt founded voluntarism and Titchener founded structuralism, and later on we're going to say that John Watson founded behaviorism. There's no founder of functionalism per se, and in the same way there's no event which started functionalism per se. It just sort of gradually, like in much of history, it's hard to tell exactly when it started or stopped or something. But one of the earliest people and largest proponents of functionalism was William James, William James had a lot of things to talk about. He said he had something to say about everything. All right, we're going to talk about a couple of his biggest contributions to psychology. He talked about the stream of consciousness, the term for the way James thought the mind worked. That that is to say, like a stream, like a river is flowing. As you look at the stream, it's always changing. Therefore, any attempt to study it in a static, it's like taking a photograph of a stream and studying it and saying this is the stream is idiocy, because the stream is constantly changing and moving. It is the act of changing and moving that makes the stream what it is. It's not a photograph. And so any attempt to sort of turn and take a piece of your consciousness and study it didn't make sense. You have to study the whole thing. You have to study what its purpose is. You got to study what it accomplishes. Okay, that kind of a thing. Whoop, using the wrong mouse. He talked about self-esteem. He was one of the first people to add self-esteem to psychology. Self-esteem was quite an interesting contention for him. He said, self-esteem is a mathematical formula which is created by successes over pretensions, right? Success, that is to say, pretensions are things that you attempt, or things that you, goals that you have, something like that, goals that you have. Successes are, of course, success. And so what happens is that your self-esteem will be relatively high if, number one, you're a very successful person, or two, you don't set your pretensions very high, okay? And so he said, look, if somebody's, let's say, for example, if somebody just, I want to be president, I'm going to be president, I'm going to be president, that's a pretension. And it's one that's probably never going to become a success, probably not. And so what's going to happen is this person could be miserable their whole life because they have this giant pretension, I want to be president, and they don't have any success to go with it. So what happens is you could either A, become president, yeah, that'd be awesome, which would be a success, or B, you could just say, you know what, I'm never going to be president, I'm happy with what I've got, and drop the pretensions in the bottom. Either one of them will lead to higher self-esteem, and it's quite an interesting way to deal with a thought that you could take self-esteem and quantify it, and describe it in a quantified mathematical fashion. He had something to say about emotions. He set out the James Lange theory of emotions. And the James Lange theory of emotions is actually pretty interesting, too. It's this notion that I'm happy because I smile. Okay? Common sense says I smile because I'm happy. Happiness comes first, and then the act of smiling as a result. William James said, no, 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 no. The act of smiling leads to happiness. See, William James was very, very famous for his crippling depression. He had crippling depression. And he had some real problems. He didn't know how to solve the free will debate. I mean, he really had some issues. So one day he says, you know what? I'm going to use my free will, and I choose to get this depression out. And so what he did was he said, I'm going to start to smile. That's it. I'm just going to walk around with a smile all day long. And as long as I start with a smile, he said, every morning when I wake up, I start smiling. And yeah, most mornings when I start smiling, I'm faking it. I'm totally faking it. But you know what happens when I run around with that smile on my face? I start to feel better. I start to feel better. My mood improves. And in fact, even more so, people treat me better. Okay? They treat me better, which makes me feel better. And so he in theory, what he claims is he conquered his depression, his crippling depression. I mean, it was so bad. He used to go to Europe and sit in the mineral springs. This is how he even learned about Wilhelm Wundt, while he was sitting in the mineral springs in Germany, trying to recover from his crippling depression. It's quite a big thing. I just said that one. All right, then at one point, I see. William James did something kind of radical. Okay, William James decided that. Come on, where did you go? No. Okay, William James. There you are. William James decided. You know what? That he was what you call a pragmatist. See, he was a big deal about pragmatism. He said you should never ever just shut your eyes and say I refuse to accept that. If something is useful, use it. And he felt that understanding psychology, one of the things that could be used was in fact mysticism and things like this. And so in the later stages of his career, he started to get involved heavily in seances and things of this nature. And the university, he was at Johns Hopkins? Can't remember. No, Harvard? Harvard, I think. Yeah, Harvard. So anyway, he's there, and he's the chair of the psych department, and they're just like, okay, please, you got to go. We can't have this embarrassment at our school. Okay, we just can't have this. So William James had met this guy when he was in Germany, Hugo Munsterberg, and so he recommends Hugo Munsterberg to take his position. Meanwhile, Munsterberg is just he's just a free, he's working in Germany as a free teacher. He's just hoping like hell that somebody's going to pick him up, right? He's running around giving free classes trying to, so he gets picked up by Harvard here, and he becomes, was it, or Johns Hopkins? God, I can't remember, but whatever. So he becomes basically the chair of the most powerful department in America, right? Of the world, basically. And he can't even speak English. Okay, the dude doesn't even speak English. Okay, that's pretty impressive. Well, he does a lot of stuff, and Hugo Munsterberg is considered to be the father of applied psychology, because what he did was he felt, in the line of the functionalists, that psychology is useful. It should be used. Should have a purpose. So he founded forensic psychology, the application of the psychological principles to legal matters. He found things, all kinds of things, suggestion and stress and how they affect memory. Harsh interrogation leads to false confessions. He would stage robberies during class to do demonstrations. He would have at such and such time, come in and steal the things and run out. And then he would have the students try to provide eyewitness testimony so that they could study it. He wrote On the Witness Stand, and he talked about a machine that would detect lying, a lie detector machine way before such a thing existed. He's considered to be the father of industrial psychology, where you apply psychological principles to things such as employee productivity, selecting the right people for the job, designing equipment, so that would be human factors work, marketing, advertising. I mean, this is huge stuff, and he's the father of this. This is a guy that just set the whole thing up. Hugo Munsterberg had one genius phrase. He says, there's no such thing as a bad job. What there is bad placement of people into jobs, okay? Because no matter what the job is, somebody somewhere is going to love it, all right? It becomes a bad job if you put the wrong person in that job. Okay, so he felt that job selection was not just about increasing productivity and making money for a company, but it was all about increasing the life satisfaction of the general population. So he felt that he saw this industrial psychology not just as a moneymaker, which is, by the way, what it becomes, a bunch of greedy bastards making money for faceless corporations. But I'll leave that alone, all right? But it had at its root a noble goal to increase the satisfaction of the life of the worker, because at this point in history, things such as the assembly line had made work quite dehumanizing. Okay. John Dewey up at the University of Chicago had a little bit to say too. See, he was talking about reflexes, and he said, look, traditionally, you break up a reflex into the sensory processes, the brain processes, the motor responses, things like that. And he said, when you break it apart and try to study it like that, you're losing its purpose, its function. Why does it exist? Okay? And usually, the reflex's job is for adaptation, right? To help us survive or something like that. You have to look at it, though, as the three put together and directed at a goal, and that goal is usually survival, adaptation, and survival. You look at the elements, you miss the point. Harvey Carr, also at the University of Chicago, he made reference to the adaptive act, and that is like all behavior has three things: a need, a motive, something like that, something that drives that behavior, a setting where that behavior occurs, and a response that satisfies the need. Man, motivation is so cool. We'll come back to that. Clearly, this is evolutionary in thinking, because it's all about adaptation, solving problems, okay? Survival, adjusting to our environments. And so he again, just like Dewey before him, said you can't study these in isolation. They are an act, okay? Even though we talk about them as though they are separate things, they are not. They are an act. One of the other functionalists, this one was at Columbia, James McKean Cattell. He was actually one of the earlier he was actually one of the people, I don't believe it was in our presentation, but one of the earliest people in the intelligence testing work. He felt that he was at the University of Pennsylvania at that point, and he felt that all students, he felt everybody in America should be tested for intelligence. And again, he was coming out of Sir Galton's tradition that intelligence is a product of sensory acuity, and he felt that all people should have their sensory acuity tested, which was to him an intelligence test. And so they had to do a variety of different things. He had a bunch of tests. In fact, he had 50 different tests that he felt that all students coming into the University of Pennsylvania should take, and they included things such as, I mean, very interesting things such as ability to estimate 10 seconds time. Okay, how close could you get to estimating when 10 seconds were up? Or let's take a line segment and your job is to bisect it, cut it exactly in half. How closely can you get this job done? He had just so many really weird tests. They did not do a very good job of predicting success at the University of Pennsylvania like he thought they would, but this work of his actually developed into eventually into what we call the SAT, because he founded the Psychological Corporation, and the Psychological Corporation became the ETS, the Educational Testing Services, the one that does in fact run the SAT, and oh my God, so many more. So though his initial attempts to predict the success of the University of Pennsylvania students was not so hot, that is, the way he was approaching it was not so hot, clearly he others like him and his company did in fact turn this into a huge market. You want to talk about a big market? The SAT market is huge market. Okay. And along about this time, there was starting to be a little bit of work on animal research. Okay. Before this, if you wanted to know about an animal, you study an animal. If you want to know about a human, you study a human. And these people said, look, okay, number one, humans are animals. Remember, this functionalism comes directly out of the work of Darwin, right? Humans are animals, and therefore, what's true of animals is also true of humans. And in fact, as an interesting note, you study animals because animals are simpler. It's like if you want to understand gravity, should you first start looking at the movement of planets, or should you look at like how a rock falls in a vacuum? You know, duh, keep it simple. You should always look at the simplest thing first to discover what the fundamental laws are. And so the functionalists felt that studying animals would allow us to discover the fundamental underlying laws of humanity, of all animals, of course, but of humanity. Well, some of the early research was a little bit freaky. Some of the stuff, Romanes, I read the full lecture notes, man, this guy was crazy. He had some crazy stuff about the parrot laughs diabolically at the cat, and oh my lord, it's hilarious. But anyway, keeping it simple, Morgan said, look, you should always keep it simple. Use the simplest explanation possible. If you could, in fact, here it is. In no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as a result of the exercise of one which stands lower on the psychological scale. So basically what he's saying is, what's his name? The principle of, Occam's razor showed up in one of the earlier slideshows. I don't remember where, William of Ockham. And later on, we're going to call it the principle of parsimony, and that's going to be keep it simple. That is, almost always the simplest explanation is best. And so he talks about understanding animal behavior in terms of very mechanical, lawful principles, okay? And this basic statement right here is going to form in a lot of ways, justification for what later on people such as Watson and Skinner are going to do when they do research with their animals. And now here we've got a final character to put onto our slideshow. Often Thorndike is considered to be the first behaviorist, though sometimes here, as you can see, he's stuck in with the functionalists, but maybe he might be more appropriate as a behaviorist. He actually, very interesting. He was getting his master's degree under William James, and he was doing some work with chickens. And there was no place at the university for him to store his chickens. So William James volunteers, I'm sure his wife was thrilled about this, volunteers to let Thorndike keep the chickens in his basement. All right. So meanwhile, William James is living with chickens in his basement for his student. I love you guys a lot, but you put a chicken in my basement, dude, it's gone. We're done. So his most famous work, though, involved cats in a puzzle box. All right, it's under my face there in the corner, right there. All right, under the corner there of the presentation, you can see a little picture. He would put cats in a box, and then what he would do is he would there would be a variety of things that the cat would have to do to get out, like push the latch up and then pull a string and all kinds of crazy stuff. Basically, what he did was he let's keep it simple. He decided that the act of learning was a mathematically describable. You could break it down. You could see the elements. He's going to lay out, and do I have it on here? The law of effect. Now, the law of effect is so cool. It's going to form the very basis of all operant conditioning, which is a couple of slides, a couple of shows up. But all operant conditioning comes out of this notion. It says, look, behavior is controlled by its consequences. If an organism, in this case he's talking about a cat, if an organism performs a behavior, and that behavior is followed by what he called a satisfying state of affairs. In other words, if you perform a behavior and something happens afterward that feels good to you, then the probability that you do that behavior goes up in the future. And it's quite a straightforward statement, this law of effect. It becomes what later on we're just going to refer to it as the one law of learning. Okay? And so it's going to be quite powerful statement to just say, if a behavior is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, then the probability that that behavior will occur again in the future goes up. Bang. All right? And so, as I promised you earlier, the last slide does in fact say the fate of functionalism, and the answer is it didn't die. See, structuralism died. When Titchener left the university, structuralism was dead, gone. All right? As long as Titchener was alive, structuralism was alive, okay? Because he was a powerful, powerful man. But the moment he was gone, it was gone. We find functionalism never died. I mean, the practical applications of psychology live on, in fact, in some ways more than the science side does. We find that functionalism led directly to behaviorism. Obviously, as I said, Thorndike is often considered a behaviorist. But throughout all of my work, if anybody has ever sat through any of my other classes, you've heard me say we're a caveman running around in the year 2000 and whatever we're in here. And modern evolutionary psychology is, what is the function? If you want to understand the function of behavior, you have to think about where we came from, okay? What's the purpose? Why does a behavior happen? Because it had a functional purpose in the past. So clearly this type of thinking still permeates all avenues of psychology to this day. All right, we'll talk next time. I think we're going to talk Pavlov next time, if memory serves. I'm not sure, though. We'll learn when we figure it out when we get there. All right, bye-bye.